Hi, everyone. Happy Friday again. I always wonder how we get here so fast, especially in December. The month is just flying by, years flying by for sure. So I'm Natalie Irwin, Director of Stakeholder Engagement at Efficiency Canada. I'm located in Ottawa, Ontario, which is also the unceded territories of our Algonquin Nation, but we are a national organization. So welcome to another Friday Discovery session. Before we get started, a reminder to everyone that our guest speaker will speak for approximately 20 minutes before we open the floor to questions. Two ways to ask questions. One, you can raise your hand and unmute you. You can ask yourself. The second one is the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can type your question there throughout the presentation, but we won't get to it until the end of Sasha's talk. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome our guest today, Sasha Tregebov, Director of Behavioural Insights team, who will share behavioural insights approach and then take us through some case studies where their approach has been applied to reduce energy consumption. Thanks for joining us today, Sasha.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share a little bit of the field that I work in and hopefully get some great Q&A going as well. So exactly as Natalie mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about what is sort of applied behavioral science and in particular, how can it be and how has it been applied to challenges like those that are central to Efficiency Canada. So I won't sort of reintroduce myself, but to say a little bit more, the Behavioural Insights team was founded in 2010. We actually started as part of the UK government. We're now an independent, I guess sort of like a consulting company. We work with nonprofits and governments all over the world to sort of apply behavioral insights to improve outcomes for people and communities. I lead the Canadian division or team, whatever you would call it, of the organization. And we are quite specialized, but we've got lots of experience globally, sort of developing new approaches and new ideas based on behavioral science, and then rigorously, easy for me to say, testing those ideas to see if they actually work. So before I get into the sort of core content, I wanted to play a little bit of a game here, or at least this is what me and my very nerdy colleagues consider a game. You may have your own adjective for it, but I've got a list of words here and I'd like to do about 30 seconds of awkward silence without writing anything down. Try to remember as many of these words as you can. So no pen and paper, just try writing down as many of, remembering as many of the words as you can. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to remember some of these words. Now, if you do have pen and paper or your keyboard handy, please do feel free to jot down the words that you can remember, although certainly no need to do so if it's not convenient. And we'll give folks another 50 and 30 seconds or so to jot those words down. Okay, and now is the part where I cross my fingers and hope that our technology works, because we now have a poll. And I'd like you, whether you wrote them down or not, to select which of the following 6 words you happen to remember. Okay, so about half the folks have had a chance to respond, and I don't want to hold things up for too much longer. So let's go ahead and look at our results. Okay, so we've got about 2/3 of folks remembering wake, nap, and sleep, and then 56-50 for blanket. So interesting data. The point that I want to make here is that one of these words wasn't on the list. So the word sleep, which 65% of the participants here in this poll remembered, wasn't on the list at all. In case you don't believe me, here's that original list again. And so, first of all, if you remembered the word sleep, that is extremely normal. In most sort of studies that examine this sort of question of false recall of a word closely associated with a list of words, but not on that list, it's generally between 44 and 55% of participants that will have that false recall. So a little bit higher in our group, but it's an extremely normal phenomenon. And we like to use this little exercise to make a sort of fundamental point about how our brains work, about our cognitive processes. And that point is that our brains are doing sort of all of this work, all of this cognitive processing that is completely invisible to us. It's non-conscious. And in particular, what your brain is doing here is sort of like filling in a gap of information, right? Like the word sleep really should have been on that list. You had a list of 20 words that were all, intrinsically associated or tied to the concept of sleep. And this is only one small sort of manifestation of this much sort of broader insight about human cognition, about how we think, that there's all of this non-conscious work happening, that our brain is taking all of these shortcuts and sort of filling in these gaps for us and omitting other information. And one of the sort of, I think, best articulations of this is a metaphor sort of developed and employed by Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, who says, imagine as though you have sort of two modes of thinking. Two ways of thinking. And he labels these system 1 and system 2. And he talks about system 1 as this fast, intuitive, automatic system that would allow us, for example, to remember words that were not actually on the list in the first place. It allows us to, for example, take our normal daily commute from home to work, for those who aren't working at home right now, without even consciously processing that, right? You're in your car or you're on the subway and you're at the office and you've been thinking about something completely different the whole time. All of that work of figuring out where to go is happening non-consciously. And then he compares that to our other mode of thinking, that sort of slow, deliberate, analytical thinking that allows us to, do really, really complex things like, in spreadsheets and, multiply 17 by 12 in our head. It's not an intuitive answer. You need to go through a sort of deliberate cognitive process. For the commuting example, imagine that you're taking a trip in a foreign country and all the steps you go through to sort of plan that trip out. That's you using your quote unquote system 2 instead of that system 1. And so what is behavioral insights? Well, behavioral insights is fundamentally, the sort of an approach that takes into account both systems of thinking. So that takes into account both the conscious and non-conscious drivers of human behavior. So it's a way of looking at problems by looking at how people process information, make decisions, and behave that takes into account both of those non-conscious and conscious drivers of human behavior. And one of the things that's really, really important is that as much as we're learning, from behavioral economics, from social psychology, from neuroscience, about those conscious and non-conscious drivers of human behavior, there's still much more that we don't know about the human brain and our decision-making than what we do know. And so even when we have exciting new ideas inspired by this emerging body of knowledge, it's still important to really rigorously assess our ideas before making major investments in rolling out new approaches at scale. And that's why these sort of insights from behavioral science are always, or are where possible, combined with rigorous evaluation methods in applying the behavioral insights approach. So I've talked about a lot of sort of theory and how our brains work and system 1 and system 2, but at the end of the day, behavioral insights is there because it provides sort of practical ideas and practical insights. So I want to give you 2 case studies of how to use behavioral insights to address energy consumption and energy efficiency related challenges. And there are actually many studies that are out there, conducted by our organization, conducted by academics, conducted by other applied groups like our own. We've sort of chosen 2 that I hope that you'll find interesting. So the first one is about how can we help people make better decisions about long-term energy use when it comes to purchasing appliances. And so here what we did is we worked with a retailer in the UK, a big department store called John Lewis that sells a lot of appliances. And there's already a pretty strong energy efficiency labeling sort of regime in place in EU countries. But one of the shortcuts that our brain takes is to sort of discount, or in some extreme cases, even ignore the long-term costs and benefits of our choices, instead focusing more, quote unquote, myopically on the sort of short-term implications of our decisions. And because the sort of energy costs of an appliance accrue over the long term, we wanted to provide an additional prompt for people to think about that. And so what we did is we tested out what it would look like to what impact it would have on human behavior and consumer decision-making, to add a sort of somewhat prominent, although not overwhelmingly so, indication of the lifetime electricity costs of each appliance. And we wanted to see whether adding these sort of lifetime costs might help shift people's decisions by providing this sort of salient added up information of the cost over time. So not saying it'll be X dollars per year or per month, but giving it in one solid number. And what we found is that for one specific category of appliances, adding this information really did shift consumer decision-making based on this study. So we saw people purchasing lower energy intensity combined washer dryers. And we think the reason that we saw an effect for those washer dryers, but not for the other types of appliances that we ran the study on, is because the lifetime running costs were much higher for this category of appliance. And therefore that information perhaps was more important to people. Now, if we return to that sort of initial analogy, what we've done is we've made it sort of easier for people to use their system too, right? We've sort of boosted their ability to do that analytical work by making it sort of less complex to think about the long-term costs. So second case study here, this was with households. So this was about household energy use. And before I get into this case study, I want to say that we drew a lot of inspiration for this work from some pioneering work done by an organization called O-Power that some of you may be familiar with. And they sort of pioneered the use and evaluation of social comparisons as a way to reduce household energy consumption. So I just want to make sure we're not taking credit away from the great work that another organization did here. So here we were working with a sort of UN agency and the government of Moldova operating in Moldova with a desire to reduce household energy consumption, as I said. So what we did is we designed 2 letters using a variety of insights from behavioral science to encourage households to save electricity. You can see the image here, and happy to share these slides after. It might be a little bit hard to see on your screen. There are sort of 2 key components of this, although there's actually a fair number of design choices. But I would say the 2 key elements here are a comparison of your monthly electricity usage compared to an average energy efficient neighbor. And so here, this is leveraging the sort of power of what we call social norms. So one of the shortcuts that our brains take, that our sort of system 1 takes, is to use the behavior of others as a cue for our own choices. These social influences can be quite powerful. And so we wanted to compare people who were on the higher side of energy consumption with their more efficient neighbors. And we had the data to do that through our partnership with the utility. And then the other thing we did is we gave people 6 very sort of practical things they could do differently to reduce their energy consumption. So giving a simple and clear sort of information intervention. Now, the 2 letters that we tested were quite similar. One expressed the difference in energy use between the household and their more energy efficient neighbors in terms of kilowatt hours, and one tested it in terms of dollars, because we thought having that dollars saved might make it a little bit more realistic for people, a little bit more sort of intuitive for them to understand what that difference actually meant. And we ran a massive experiment. So over 100,000 households in Chisinau, Moldova. I actually practiced a lot on how to pronounce it. And of course, now that I'm here presenting, all of that has gone completely out of my mind. So apologies if we have any Moldovan friends in the audience, and if I've mispronounced that, I'm sorry. And here were the results. So what you can see here is that the 2 different letters were effective at a sort of degree of statistical significance in reducing household energy consumption. It was a relatively modest decrease between 1.4 and 1.8 percentage point relative percent change. 1.4 to 1.8% relative reduction in energy use. But frankly, that's a pretty solid result. I think people on this call may be much more knowledgeable about the sort of relative impact of different interventions on household energy consumption. But this was sort of in line with the effects that we had seen in the literature, and we and our partners on this were quite pleased with the results, because you can see, with such a large number of households receiving the letters, that's quite a significant CO2 emissions reduction, 30 tons of emissions in 1 month alone. So we were quite pleased with the impact that this had, especially given the very low cost of, sending a single letter to households. So that basically concludes the case studies. I had some sort of questions. I know I'm supposed to be the one sort of, I guess, answering the questions, but we're really curious about where you think the opportunities may be for applied behavioral science work with regard to energy efficiency priorities here in Canada. And obviously, Behavioral Insights is just one tool, right? And it's very much a complementary tool. So in particular, we're interested in, what are the, behaviors that we need to shift, but also which of those behaviors may be related to people's sort of mental shortcuts, right? They're sort of system one, rather than, for example, having insufficient resources, not having enough money to buy more efficient appliances, or not having the fundamental knowledge, for example, of how to reduce energy consumption, or, supply chain issues. Obviously, these structural factors are critically important, but our question, given our particular expertise, is where are the opportunities to apply behavioral insights? And, some of the things that we've worked on in other countries, or that we've seen researchers with similar methodologies tackle effectively in other countries, are things like adoption and effective use of the sort of smart thermostats. We've got an early collaboration underway with a partner that we're really excited about around uptake of energy assistance programs. And, we've had a lot of success with like program uptake, especially with government using this type of methodology. Labeling opportunities, perhaps if it's relevant from an efficiency standpoint, helping people switch energy providers, shift when they use energy, where sort of time of use is relevant. And then even thinking more broadly about like representativeness and who has opportunities to be working and leading in this field, in the energy sector, in the energy efficiency space more broadly. We've done a lot of work, for example, with police forces in adjusting their recruitment and hiring methods to reduce bias in order to produce more representative employment outcomes. And we thought even that may be relevant to the sector here. So I think I'm more or less on time. So I hope I haven't been speaking too quickly, but I'll just sort of stop sharing my screen there and turn it over for Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sasha. You're right on time. So you're all set. There was a lot of flurry happening in the chat that I was watching throughout your presentation. So definitely people are excited about this. I am going to open the floor to questions. Reminder, there are 2 ways to ask questions. One, raise your hand, I can unmute you. Second way is put your question in the Q&A chat and I will read it on your behalf. Also, a quick reminder that we do have one rule, which is the same rule for our presenters, and that is no sales pitches, please. And this includes any statements disguised as questions. So let's open the floor to questions. First one here is from Andrew. Great presentation. I think a big opportunity would be making energy labels mandatory when selling a house. Do any areas do this that you're aware of?
A great question. And honestly, we've thought about that too. And I think especially if those labels were sort of cleverly designed, to avoid common risks like information overload, or sort of data points that are hard for lay people to interpret. So I think if well designed, that could be an effective sort of strategy. given how important those sort of fundamental issues of the design of the house or the dwelling are. I'm not personally aware of sort of leading approaches internationally, so I apologize, I don't have a good answer.
No worries. I would say there aren't in Canada right now. So, but I know there are places in the US. It would be great if anyone is interested in that to please do some advocacy and talk to your elected official, as well as if you know any real estate agents, please talk to them, because a lot of holdback is actually from the real estate agency saying that it's going to take longer to sell a house because of it, which is actually not true based on studies that I've read. So please tell your friends and family that are real estate agents is actually a good thing, as well as for consumers. It's nice to know the house that you're buying, what you're getting, right? A question here is, how long do behavior changes typically last? So for how long can you count those energy savings? For 1 year or longer?
Yeah, really good, important question. So it varies. So sometimes these behavioral interventions, which are sometimes described as nudges, especially in media, sometimes they're effective because of the sort of novelty of them. And in those cases, they often have shorter term effects. What's sort of powerful is when these nudges can shift people's habits, right? So in the case of, I'm not aware of like long-term longitudinal studies to see the impact of these changes over time, but my guess is that the changes in household energy consumption, for example, are more enduring because rather than sort of one-off choices, people are like programming their thermostats differently or developing different habits around their use of appliances or other energy intensive activities. So it certainly depends, and it basically depends on the sort of mechanism through which the change occurs, where if it's a habit-based mechanism, those changes tend to persist, whereas if it's sort of one-off behaviors, those changes tend not to persist, although they can still be helpful and important. Natalie, I was wondering, there was one question that I noticed. I've not really been able to keep up, but there's one question that I noticed about vehicles and getting people to buy electric. And we actually just finished a project on that for the government of Canada. So I was wondering if I could sort of tackle that one, given that I actually have something to say about it. So it's fascinating around electric vehicle adoption. And we've been doing a bunch of work in this in the UK and then more recently in Canada. I mean, the challenge that I always get, which is I think an important one, is that there are significant supply constraints, I believe. So there are quite long waiting lists to purchase electric vehicles. And so I think there's a bit of a structural factor there. Often when people need a new vehicle, they're not in a position to be on a 2-year waiting list. And so I just want to first acknowledge that there are some important limitations there. I do think there's a sort of behavioral, quote unquote, angle to this as well. So first of all, I think we are making it very hard for people to understand the true cost of vehicle ownership over the average vehicle life cycle. And so I would love to see at point of sale, definitely integration of all relevant government rebates and incentives so that you can have a true dollar to comparison. But what I think would be even more powerful is, on comparison shopping websites, in dealerships, if there was some sort of either mandated, preferably, or perhaps sort of voluntary shift in how we communicate and articulate vehicle pricing to give consumers less work that they need to do to make decisions around the true long-term costs of vehicle ownership. Oh, there's also one other idea that we have that I'm less convinced on, but I think it's sort of quite interesting. Range anxiety is a big issue, and we think from the research that we've seen it's an overstated issue. And so one idea that we have is, how can you make the charging infrastructure more memorable, more salient to people? So things like when you open your Google Maps, for me, I get gas stations, I don't get charging stations. Or when I drive by a gas station that has a charging station, there aren't big sort of shiny blue lights or clear national labeling to just get that in our sort of brains, right? That no, that infrastructure is there. We're going by it. It exists. We're just not noticing it in some cases.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, for sure. I have a question here from Raphael: is how are power rates structured could stimulate better use of energy? So do you think that would be the case?
Yeah, and I actually do. I mean, it's sort of complex to think through, but I think there is this somewhat naive view among some folks that people respond in a really sort of direct way to financial incentives. So, for example, I think people overestimated the impact that time of use pricing would have. Like from a purely economic modeling perspective, you'd expect to see larger changes, but the problem is the difference in pricing and those rate structures are not always. Again, I use the word salient. Behavioral, scientists use this term all the time. Like they're not immediately available at the point when we're making decisions about our energy use. So I think there's more work to be done to sort of like increase the sort of relevance and salience of those pricing structures. And there's even more to say on pricing, but honestly, some of it is like complex to think through and a little bit hard to respond to on the spot. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there for sort of behaviorally informed rate structures. Although I haven't seen a ton of examples of that, but I don't know the sector super well. So it may absolutely be out there and I just happen to not be aware of it.
Yeah, I think you bring up the important point of confusion with the time of rates, because it also changes on like the time changes, it changes on weekends versus weekdays, and people have to think about too many things. And then also during COVID, a lot of utilities decided to change the time of rate structure.
Yeah, and we just need to be aware of, there's another sort of jargony term, and so I'll try to avoid this, but like there's this notion of cognitive bandwidth, that we have a certain amount of sort of cognitive processing available to us at any time, right? And people like generally like people lead busy lives, they've got kids yelling at, screaming at them, dogs that need to go for a walk, they've got their job, right? And it's like, we can't expect people to sort of hold on to all of this information and integrate this information into their day-to-day lives unless we make it really easy for them to do so. And there may actually be less sophisticated pricing structures that actually work better, even if they have less strong incentives from a behavior change perspective, just because they're simpler for us to know. I'm like, okay, it costs half as much during this time. And, the sort of hardcore energy economists and energy analysts may be like, no, that's not optimal, right? It's got to be, 7 different layers of this stuff. And, I think there's just a good conversation to be had there.
Yeah, definitely. There are already so many rules when it comes to laundry. We don't need to add to it. I have another question here is how time flexible are behavior changes? And can behavior changes be like quote unquote faster and perhaps matched with renewable energy supply increases and decreases?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understand the question. Is the question around how long it takes for these changes to take effect that are prompted by these sort of behavioral interventions?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the question. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah.
You're allowed to say, I don't know.
I don't know, right? Like, I think in general, if the effects, for example, of a communications-based intervention, right? Like, so, with a labeling intervention, it's obviously at the point of sale, right? If people leave the store without integrating and using that information, it's probably too late, right? Because it's going to go out their head. Similar when we use a letter trial or an email or one of these communication-based intervention, we usually anticipate that if it doesn't have an effect within the next billing cycle, it's unlikely to have an effect. But other interventions that we design are more like structural, right? Shifts to sort of process or physical environment. And in those cases, people may need to get habituated to those new, for example, retail environments, or we've recently done some work on left turn safety where we redesigned intersections. And there we think habit formation may be the key mechanism, and therefore it may actually take time to see the effects in the data.
Yeah, very interesting. The question here is, you might not know the answer, but I also have some comments on it as well if you don't, is would more info on energy on consumer reports be useful?
Yeah, so my instinct on these informational interventions, right, where we're basically trying to boost people's system too by providing them with better data from which to make an analytical decision. My instinct is, first of all, people tend to overestimate the sort of power of these interventions, because we assume people read and, people often don't read all the information available to them, as folks with a mortgage may know. But anyways, but they absolutely can be powerful, and they're worth considering, but you need to really think about the design of that information, and you need to think about limiting the imposition on people's cognitive bandwidth. So not all of the data, but the most valuable, intuitive data presented in a way that's often visual or narrative. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I would say yes, but only if, is the general answer to that question. And Natalie, I'd love to know your perspectives on the issue.
I was just going to say with the OPAR report, so yes, with the comparison, but sometimes just giving people information is not enough because it's an information overload. And like what you said, you can't assume people read everything. So a question here actually related to that is from Eric, is in the examples used, the factors were relative to the self-determined goals. So are the benefits of the goals that were identified by the quote unquote label creators, example, the goal of the energy savings is X, and giving an update on subsequent bills?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So it's really important to sort of define what outcome measures are actually relevant to you, both in terms of your evaluation strategy, but also in terms of the design of your new approach. And for us, our expertise is related to behavioral science and evaluation. So we generally rely on sort of domain experts, right? So we'll consult with, whether it's academics or whether it's professionals working with industry to sort of help us understand, well, what are the metrics that really, really matter for the sort of overall policy goals or social impact goals that we're pursuing, right? So, what's the right way to sort of operationalize these things? So that's our sort of general principle, is to talk a lot to sort of deep experts to make sure that we're specifying and sort of gearing towards the right measures and avoiding, well, but actually, if you reduce that, there's going to be this other compensatory thing and you're not actually solving the problem. Those are hugely significant issues that need to be really robustly addressed in the design of one of these new approaches.
Definitely. A question here, which is leads to another interesting question, is behavior compared to convenience. So are folks willing to adjust? Do you want to just speak to that kind of topic versus question?
Yeah, so I would say the single most powerful, so, we've developed a sort of simplified framework for people that want to start applying behavioral insights in their own sphere. We call it the EAST framework. I can send you the report or it's all publicly available. I think it's quite interesting and quite helpful. It sort of summarizes some of the most robust results in behavioral science in a sort of layperson centric way. So EAST stands for make the behavior easy, attractive, social, and timely. And, I don't have time to sort of get into all of that, but easy is the first and most important part of that framework. So people are incredibly responsive to even the smallest frictions in their day-to-day experience. Basically, this is a crude analogy, but you can imagine that our brains are just constantly looking out for opportunities to not do something. And that's actually a really important evolved response. I'm not being critical at all of human cognition or behavior, right? It's a sort of evolutionary product. I think hard to make that claim definitively, but I feel pretty confident in that. And so the convenience of a behavior is a critical and hugely underestimated determinant of the sort of prevalence of that behavior.
And then there's also a question here on Energy Star label studies. And I'm assuming I don't know the answer to that one because that's not your expertise. So I'm going to put a link to a report in the chat there. So yes, definitely. And that's why a lot of the studies have come out of the US because that's where Energy Star started. I think it started in the US and we've adopted it here in Canada. So there's, yes, quick answer is yes, it is very effective. And that's why it's continued to be used. And just one last question here is, Sasha, I'm just curious if you could share one last message around behavior change with everyone here today, and that you hope that people took away from your presentation. What would that message be?
I think I actually want to go back to the last point I made about the importance of making it easy. So if you are, through your work or even in your personal life, hoping to help organizations, individuals, households reduce energy consumption or otherwise contribute to these goals. Think sort of long and hard about how you can make that behavior change as easy as possible, and sort of removing any frictions that you may be inadvertently creating through, for example, business or consumer facing processes. I think that would be my single, hopefully best piece of advice there.
Definitely a great piece of advice for everyone here today. So thank you so much for joining us, Sasha. Some really insightful pieces on behavior change and consumers for people to take away and kind of dig into deeper future, I think, for sure. And thanks to everyone for joining us and for some hard questions, I would say, today, but Sasha handled them with grace and ease for sure. So I'm pleased to share that next week, I'm actually going to be joined by our executive director for our last discovery session of 2021. So Corey and I are going to share an open discussion with everyone. So not our typical discovery session. We did it last year and it was quite popular. People really enjoyed it, leaving everything on a high note. And 2021 was definitely a high note for sure for energy efficiency. So we hope that you join us and share your highlights and also some of your New Year's resolution plans when it comes to energy efficiency for 2022. So thanks again, Sasha. Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.